Hello, welcome everybody. Hello, nice to see so many folks here today. Please take a moment to get yourself situated and comfortable and relax. Your cameras and mics will remain off for the presentation, so you have plenty of opportunity to eat and drink and get comfy. I've got my favorite blanket on my lap today, and I've got, a nice smelly thing burning in the background for me. Please go ahead and use the chat box or emojis and reactions anytime you'd like. We just want this to be a really comfortable and relaxed presentation for you and for us and for our presenters. Hopefully you're not having horrible weather and your internet is coming through nicely today. We had a lot of snow where I live this morning. I just want to take a moment to introduce our interpreters today. Doing ASL interpretation and currently on screen is Vanessa. And then we also have Matt. We have simultaneous French to English and English to French interpretation with Merlin and Isabella. Some of our presentations today will be in English, some will be in French, so you may need to access a different channel, and Lauren will help us through that later. Captioning today is being provided by Lori. And then, although we are having some tech issues with our LSQ interpreters today, and we're trying to get them on screen as soon as possible, and they will be Helen and Nicole. So we'll get started in about 2 minutes, so take some time, do whatever you need to get comfortable. Hopefully you're having a really good day and you're joining us and getting ready to learn and talk about disability justice and access, and we're really excited to have so many people back with us today. I'm just going to read this slide on the screen. It is a white slide with at the top 2 black icons. One is for closed captioning, the other is for sign language interpretation. They're at the top left. At the top right is a lock that is open with a heart in the middle, and enabling change is written beside that. Underneath our icons is the title Disability Justice and Programming, Mobility, Accessibility, and People Management, and beneath that is that same title translated into French. Beside that are pictures of our 3 presenters, Ophira, Charlotte, and Sean. And then at the bottom of the slide are the logos of the 3 partners on the project, Orchestras Canada, Ontario Presents, Réseau Ontario, and finally in the bottom right corner is our funding partner, the Ministry, Ontario Province. Hello, I'm Rachel Marks. A middle-aged white woman with chin-length faded dyed hair. I'm wearing purple cat's eye glasses with sparkles in the corner, and I think this color is burgundy, mottled dress with a scoop neck. My pronouns are she and her, and my sign name is an R swimming across my chest. Welcome to Session 5 of Enabling Change, Accessibility for the Performing Arts, a 6-session learning series. Before we begin today, I'd like to pass over to Maeva LeBlanc, Programming and Special Projects Coordinator at Réseau Ontario. Thank you, and that is the end of my thought.
Merci Rachel. Bonjour tout le monde, je suis très heureuse d'être ici aujourd'hui et de vous présenter cette session. Je m'appelle Maeva Leblanc, je suis originaire de France et j'ai déménagé ici à Ottawa il y a maintenant 8 ans. Le prénom Maeva est d'origine polynésienne et signifie bienvenue. Mes parents aimaient beaucoup ce prénom. Je suis une femme de taille moyenne, caucasienne, avec des cheveux mi-longs bruns. J'ai des lunettes marron, carrées, 2 piercings en dessous de ma lèvre et un anneau sur la narine droite. Derrière moi, dans mon salon, se trouve une peinture graffiti qui représente un corbeau à côté d'une femme, fait par l'artiste franco-ontarienne Mick Michel. Je suis donc chez moi à
I am home in Ottawa, a city located on the unceded territory of Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Have been here since immemorial time. Their culture and
territoires sur lesquels vous vivez et vous travaillez. Je suis très fière de faire partie de ce projet. L'inclusion commence par de petites étapes du quotidien. C'est donc avec l'aide financière du ministère des services aux aînés et de l'accessibilité
Accessibility and Orchestras Canada that we partners, that is Ontario Presents Is Ontario, are able to bring you this series of webinars. Over the past few months, experts, artists, and workers have been working on this project, and we'd like to thank them. Lauren, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everybody. So I'm going to work through some tech notes with you. Just briefly, give me a moment to put my video on the screen. Okay. Thank you so much. So my name is Lauren Drew. I work for Orchestras Canada as Director of Member Services and Learning. I'm a white woman in my 20s wearing a blue shirt. I have dark brown hair with bangs, and I'm wearing a black headset. There's a gray wall behind me. First, we have French-English simultaneous interpretation available. So to enable this, please navigate to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. It will either look like a globe or you may hear it as interpretation. Select that, and then two options will come up, French or English. You can select the channel that's best for you from there. Please note that we'll have a little bit of switch back and forth between English and French today. So Sean and Ophira will be presenting in English and Charlotte will be presenting in French. So you'll want to make sure that you're on the right channel for you right at the beginning. So moving along to ASL and LSQ interpretation. I apologize for the delay with LSQ. We're working on that right now. So make sure that you have the speaker view setting turned on. Please note that ASL and LSQ interpreters will switch out with their co-interpreter every so often by turning their video on and off. You can move the video boxes around to reposition interpreters for a place that's better. Do so by clicking their video feed, dragging it to where it's better for you, and then you'll note also that we're using PowerPoint throughout. All of our presenters will be. To resize the PowerPoint so that it's a little bit smaller and the interpreter video feeds are a little bit larger, you can hover between the section of the Zoom screen that is the screen share and the video feeds, and there'll be a gray line that comes up. You can drag that gray line to the left, and that'll make the screen share smaller, the video feeds a little bit bigger. Next, we have live captioning available in English. So note that this is a real person writing the captions, and there might be a slight delay. In the bottom of the Zoom window, find the live transcript button, click the up arrow to show two options, show subtitle to start displaying the live captions, and similarly to turn it off, click that button again and select hide subtitle. And then a few privacy notes. So we are recording the session. You won't show up in the recording as your video and microphones have been turned off to preserve internet bandwidth and also reduce any background noise. You're welcome to use the chat to interact, and our host Rachel will read aloud any broadly relevant comments from the chat. We'll be saving a copy of the Zoom chat for questions at the Friday coffee chat. If you don't wish to have your full name visible, you can change it by navigating to the participant list in Zoom, right-clicking on your name, and then selecting rename. So that's it for me, and I will pass back over to Rachel. End of thought for Lauren.
This is Rachel speaking. Thanks, Lauren. We have another great day planned for us all today. We'll start off with a session on disability justice from Sean Lee. This presentation will really ground us in the why of all the work we're undertaking or about to start. Then we'll begin to look at organizational applications and working with the deaf and disability community with a presentation from Charlotte Jacob McGuire. Then we'll take a break. After the break, we'll come back to meet with Ophira Kaloff, who'll speak to us about broader artist and audience access and help to fill in some of the ties between the two previous presentations. As usual, please put any questions into the chat and I can ask those for you. But we've also planned a 10-minute mini panel Q&A at the end of the presentation with all of the presenters. If we don't get to all of the questions today, we'll put them in our parking lot for discussion on Friday. While we're talking about Friday, I'd just like to remind you that pre-registration for the coffee chats is required, and this is so we know what access points might be needed and how many people will be attending. And just a final quick reminder that this series is by no means an exhaustive look into disability rights, equity, or inclusion. It is more a thoughtful approach on how to get started or how to expand the access points that you are already offering. All right, let's get started. Sean Lee, he, they, is an artist and curator exploring the notion of disability arts as the last avant-garde. He's currently the Director of Programming at Tangled Art and Disability and is on the Board of Directors for the Creative Users Project, CARFAC Ontario, and the Toronto Art Council, and is a member of the Ontario Art Council's Deaf and Disability Advisory Group and chair of the Toronto Art Council's Visual Arts Media Arts Committee. I'm going to send this over to Sean, and that is the end of my thought.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Rachel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen first. There we go. So, hi everyone. As Rachel said, my name is Sean Lee. I use he and they pronouns. And I'll just start with a self-description. So I'm someone who's male presenting. I'm East Asian Chinese with light skin. I'm somebody who's visibly disabled. So my back curves, my shoulders are uneven. And if we were to meet in person, you'd probably notice I'm quite short of stature. I've got black hair that runs, past my shoulders. This used to be a very cropped haircut, and I just haven't cut it since lockdown began. So this is 2 years of growth. Let's see, and I'm wearing kind of just like these steampunk glasses. They're green with gold rims that sort of float on the frames. I'm in a black t-shirt that says, "The future is accessible." It's a shirt made by a disability YouTuber named Annie Sagara. And I'm in my living room. It's a pretty nondescript space. I have some twinkle lights just to help kind of animate an otherwise white wall. And so I'm sharing a screen right now, and it says an introduction to disability justice. We've got my name, Sean Lee, and then Tangled Art Plus Disability, where I work. And as well, we have the Tangled logo sort of as a template fixture that'll be on all the slides in the upper right-hand corner. So I'll start with a couple of protocols. On the screen, it says this text is size 18. This will be the minimum font size for presentation text. All images and text will contrast strongly with background colors. I'll do my best to use plain language throughout the presentation. If there's anything that you've missed or you want clarification on, feel free to put that into the chat. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to also just use the chat function to message the moderators, either privately or to everybody, if you do have any questions. And if there are other ways that I can make this more accessible to you, please feel free to make a note, and I can try to do something to help just make this a better experience. And I think, I really like to do these protocols at the beginning of any presentations I do, because these access protocols are something that are still kind of unfamiliar to a lot of people. For instance, what is the self-description? I know that this group here, if you've attended some of the past presentations, that this group is practicing them, which is excellent. But I think I'd like to underscore access protocols and have them listed, because I think doing things like this, like having a visual description, these are practices that many disabled people enact when we gather together physically and digitally. And I think we do this as a way of mitigating kind of the normative assumptions of who is present and participating and leading in these spaces. Self-description, for instance, being just one part of a host of cultural practices that have been created and established by disability community to hack the lack of accessibility in these sort of day-to-day encounters we have with one another. And that's what I'm most interested in and will be exploring today, is that hacktivist spirit and the ways it can better inform our approaches to accessibility, helping us to desire disability rather than try to eliminate its presence. And we can't have disability culture and practices without disability justice. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is just how to unpack what disability justice really is. And of course, this is something that I'm privileged to have been able to learn from other peers, from other members of the disability community, particularly queer and trans, BIPOC, disabled folks. So I want to start off with a quote, and I think this quote really helps us understand disability justice. It's from Mia Mingus, who's an activist and artist from the disability community, and it says, "We don't want to simply join the ranks of the privileged. We want to dismantle those ranks and the systems that maintain them." And so I think it's important to note that there is a real distinction between what disability rights is and what disability justice is. The disability rights movement, as you've learned, had sort of emerged in the 60s and 70s and was inspired by the great civil rights movements of the time. Disabled folks started to really question why so many disability community members were institutionalized and excluded. And so the conversations that began really radically interrogated society's assumptions about what disabled people could or could not do and how disabled folks should live. Disability activists began to really actively challenge the exclusion, discrimination, and lack of choice and control they experienced in daily life, and the prevailing negative attitudes that were really rampant in society. And so these questionings, this was really the beginning of the disability people's rights movement. It was a turning point in Western culture that recognized disability as a legislative issue, as a human rights issue. And this sort of new approach to thinking about disability reframed disability as a civil rights and equality issue rather than a medical or charitable issue. And so these groups that began to gather really demanded choice and control over their lives, and equally importantly, began to lay out the changes in society that would need to happen in order for disabled people to have the same rights and opportunities as others. And so ultimately, these acts materialized this notion of accessibility as being a right for disabled folks. And it helped to establish things such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and in Canada, equivalents like the AODA and the Accessible Canada Act. And while these were really, huge coups for disability activism, the prevailing post-ADA rhetoric doesn't really help paint a complete picture of disability today. Because in order for disability activists to get buy-in, and in order for disability rights to be passed through legislative processes, the language of accessibility really had to be tamed and pared back. So what do I mean by this? For instance, in the 60s and 70s, we happened to have a large number of injured vets in America returning from the war. And so politicians really gained traction for disability rights, often through this lens of rehabilitation, so that it could be palatable to a world that was largely experiencing disability as a human rights issue for the first time. And this way of understanding access focused on the physical ways that disability could be mitigated so that folks could participate in society. And the discourse that formed was largely built around the need for disabled people to become independent and thus active economic and political citizens. And when we understand that, we can understand that access was manifested under the terms of capitalism then. That the ADA really had this very limited and spotty enforcement. And so checkbox approaches to accessibility had to become largely the way that disability rights was, and to a degree still is, being enforced. This method of approaching access, really takes it on as something that is a series of logistics and standards. And while it means that these minimum accessibility standards can help get disabled folks, physically through the door, it doesn't really paint a complete picture. It creates this need instead to address able-bodiedness in existing built environments that inadvertently promote the idea of disabled folks as being standardized, as being de facto white or heteronormative or middle class. And it almost always assumes disability as a physical issue. And so, because of this sort of perceived flattening of disability as a single issue approach, a new movement within the last 15, 20 years emerged called disability justice. And this was led by queer and trans disabled BIPOC folks. And so here in this quote that I've kind of presented, Mia Mingus is emphasizing that this work is about shifting how we understand access. As she says, moving away from the individualized and independence-framed notions of access put forward by the disability rights movement, and instead working to understand access as collective and interdependent. So I've got my next slide here, and this is an image from Sins and Ballad. It was made by Mika Pizant, and it depicts a disabled Black and non-Black person of color, people of color, holding hands while one is in a wheelchair and the other person is on the floor, missing both their left arm and leg. Under where they're holding hands, it says, "To exist is to resist," in yellow. And right above this writing, against kind of like an aqua blue background, is the text, "Disability justice means resisting together, from solitary cells to open air prisons." So in an article called "Changing the Framework," Mia Mingus writes that disability justice activists are engaged in building an understanding of disability that's more complex, whole, and interconnected than what we previously found. Disability is not monolithic. Ableism plays out very differently for wheelchair users, deaf people, or people who have mental, psychiatric, and cognitive disabilities. None of these are mutually exclusive, and they're all complicated by race, class, gender, immigration, sexuality, welfare status, incarceration, age, and geographic location. And so what disability justice does is it directly challenges the ableist systems that make ableism possible. And people who experienced intersectional and multiple forms of oppression were oftentimes excluded from one another's spaces. Oftentimes, people in BIPOC and queer spaces were unable to go into gatherings because they were disabled, whether physically or just feeling that they weren't invited. And conversely, disabled folks were oftentimes excluding and erasing the experiences of BIPOC and queer and trans folks from being able to gather, with this perception from disability rights that disability is largely a white issue. And so disability justice seeks to better articulate the ways that ableism is actually a deeply imbricated form of oppression with other, systemic forms of oppression that uphold this inequity. And so disability justice really centers those most impacted and advocates for change in those very systems. We can think of disability rights as being something that's more compliance-based. And so the language of disability justice is really about radical access. And so what I'll talk about now are 10 principles of disability justice that have been developed through Sins Invalid. And these are 1, intersectionality. We do not live single issue lives. And this is a quote from Audre Lorde. And intersectionality is really about what I just kind of explained. You know, it's ableism coupled with white supremacy, supported by capitalism, underscored by heteropatriarchy, which has rendered the majority of the world, quote unquote, invalid. Leadership of the most impacted, and this is a quote from Aurora Levins-Morel, we are led by those who most know these systems. Anti-capitalist politics. In an economy that sees land and humans as components of profit, we are anti-capitalist by the nature of having non-conforming body minds. Commitment to cross-movement organizing, shifting how social justice movements understand disability and contextualize ableism, disability justice, lends itself to politics of alliance. Recognizing wholeness. People have inherent worth outside of commodity relations and capitalist notions of productivity. Each person is full of history and life experiences. Sustainability. We pace ourselves individually and collectively to be sustained long term. Our embodied experiences guide us towards ongoing justice and liberation. Commitment to cross-disability solidarity. We honor the insights and participation of all of our community members, knowing that isolation undermines collective liberation. Interdependence. We meet each other's needs as we build towards liberation, knowing that state solutions inevitably extend into further control over lives. Collective access. As brown, black, and queer-bodied disabled people, we bring flexibility and creative nuance that go beyond able-bodied minded normativity to be in community with each other. And collective liberation. No body or mind can be left behind. Only mobbing together can we accomplish the revolution we require. And so these are the 10 principles that were developed by Sins Invalid. And they note really that it's meant to honor the longstanding legacies of resilience and resistance, which are the inheritance all of us whose bodies and minds don't conform experience. Disability justice better helps us understand the ways that ableism is systematic and needs to be included in our analysis of oppression. And so I'll talk about, what actually is ableism. And I have on the screen, this sort of dictionary-looking definition of ableism. It's got this deep purple and blue gradient background with the word ableism. And it says, a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. And these constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and or their ability to satisfactorily produce, reproduce, excel, and quote-unquote behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And this is a working definition by Talila T.L. Lewis, developed in community with other disabled, Black, and negatively racialized people, especially Dustin Gibson. And so I think this definition of ableism helps us understand that embodying disability justice means that we can't simply try to use accessibility as a way to slide disabled people into the prevalent normative culture because it's steeped in ableism. Leah Lakshmi Pyepsna Samarasina really best said it when she said, "You want to know how you're doing disability justice right? You'll know because you'll know you're doing it because people will show up late. Someone will vomit. Someone will have a panic attack. And nothing will happen on time because the ramp is broken on the supposedly quote unquote accessible building. You won't meet your benchmarks on time or ever, and we won't be grateful to be included. We'll want to set the agenda, and what our leadership looks like may include long, sick, or crazy leaves, being nuts in public, or needing to empty an ostomy bag and being on Vicodin at work. It's slow. It's people, even the most social justice minded, abled folks, staring at or getting freaked out by us. It looks like what many mainstream abled people have been taught to think of as failure. And this is in CareWorks, which is a publication made by Leah that I highly recommend folks check out. And how do you embody this? That's something I've been thinking a lot about. And to better understand this, I want to turn to a recent exhibition that we did at Tangled, actually. I've got a photo here of the exhibition Hidden, which was curated by Gloria Swain. We've got this wall in the foreground that's largely empty except for text and headphones and an ASL monitor. And in the background, there's a lot of other artworks from the show. And just as a bit of background, Gloria was an artist in residence at Tangled who had a solo show with us in 2016. She identifies as an aging Black mad woman, and Gloria described her practice as one that really opens up community conversations about Black mental health in response to an absence of anti-Black racist mental health services. And so in 2019, we invited Gloria back, this time to curate an exhibition. Curation to us feeling like an extension of her artistic practice. And she talked about, in the exhibition statement for Hidden, the ways that she explores intergenerational trauma and isolation and lived experiences of Black artists with hidden disabilities. She really drew on this part of ableism's definition given to us by TL.
Sean,
That suggests, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but part of the screen share has gone white on the screen, and I just wanted to let you. Oh, thank you so much. I'll leave now.
Sorry, I'm moving back and forth between my notes and this, so that might be what's happening. If you let me know, I can always fix that up. Thanks. So, as I was saying, we invited Gloria back, and she was drawing on that part of the definition of ableism that really suggests that ableism is part of an anti-Black system that assigns value based on, our abilities to produce and excel and behave, and enforces this false idea of normalcy. And I think it was really tested when one of the artists who Gloria selected for the show wasn't able to really attend any of the meetings or the prep sessions, and ultimately had to excuse themselves from the exhibition. But rather than just drop this artist, Gloria did some reworking. She held space for the artist with this empty white wall and a statement on how neoliberal, capitalist, and sanist and ableist systems exclude some artists, particularly Black, mad, and disabled artists, from cultural institutions. Instead of just removing the artist from the exhibition and scrubbing any sort of trace from the show, this wall really held space for them. And the artist was paid a portion of their artist fees and acknowledged for the work that they did in this process. And I think Gloria was providing access in a way that really both disrupted these neoliberal expectations of what productivity and institutional expectations of a complete exhibition look like, and was embracing this idea that true disability justice is messy. And ultimately, it's not really meant to fit into kind of traditional movements and nonprofit industry. and complex, structures like these, because our bodies and our minds are really just too wild to fit into these structures. And on the next slide, I have a series of words from the exhibition Undeliverable, curated by Carmen Papalia. So it's just a white wall with the word undeliverable hand painted on the wall in repeating patterns. And so I'm going to use our final few minutes together to just highlight a movement within disability justice, which asks us to critically engage with how we think about access. As I mentioned, compliance-based accessibility can be incredibly problematic for how it flattens our understanding of the disability experience. And this sort of checkbox approach just purely takes up access as a set of logistics that set up minimum accessibility standards. This specific way of knowing disability gives the impression that access is something you can almost measure scientifically, that it's standardizable and has a finished outcome. And it's left out the idea that access is actually an ongoing process and something that people may need in different ways. This theory away from a compliance-based approach is what disability scholar Amy Hamrai calls critical access. And critical access understands that accessibility is political work. As Hamrai says in their book, Building Access, in the early 21st century, things like universal design gained popularity as an easy reference to the idea that inclusive design benefits everyone, regardless of disability or age. And its global circulation and reach into a number of disciplines beyond architecture, however, makes it easy to forget that universal design is a very recent discourse, and that how this phenomenon is named, defined, and justified is a product of the post-ADA era, with the post-ADA narrative dictating that accessible design, like freedom, is a self-evident, common sense good. But Hamrai kind of goes on to explain that universal design is really just the preferred approach to access under a neoliberal capitalist system, because it follows this one-size-fits-all solution, which makes more economic sense. For example, if a ramp is only useful for a wheelchair user, it's suddenly defined as an excessive expense. But when the ramp is justified because it helps other people who are pushing strollers or dollies come into the space and spend more money in the space, it suddenly makes economic sense. Critical access, however, really asks us to move away from the idea of access as being this, common sense good that should benefit everybody, and instead understand that the universal design maxim, accessible design is good for everyone, is justified only through the idea that the ramp has value when it's recognized for its potential to bring more revenue in the form of untapped market shares, and not for its ability to actually create access. The trouble with this is that the neoliberal conception of accessibility doesn't question what it is we have access to. And differently, disability and deaf culture takes up access as this never-finished project that's built from an iterative, interdependent, and evolving set of practices that's shaped by co-design processes by users of these different ways of understanding and navigating the world. And this is why I put up this photo from a recent exhibition of ours called Undeliverable. In Undeliverable, Carmen Papalia, who's the curator, worked with the other artists to consider how it is that disabled folks could reclaim the museum on the terms of the disabled body mind. And one of the things that really came up was that this idea of deliverables was always forcing disabled artists to, contort themselves, to produce in an unsustainable way. And Undeliverable instead set a space to honor Krypton. As disability scholar Alison Kafer says, rather than bend disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, Crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. And so this is what that proposed title was really attempting to reference in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way. It was, how do we resist these neoliberal politics of production and really reclaim the museum and honor oneself? And so when the show, when Undeliverable first opened, we really decided to take a relaxed approach to how it is we would install this show, with artist statements not arriving on time, with some works not being complete. But instead of apologizing and trying to hide this fact, we really decided to lean into this as a cultural aesthetic. We hand painted the word undeliverable anywhere that a work wasn't present. And over time, this wall was slowly filled up with artist statements, with different artworks, as artists began to bring those things in, as they began to work at a pace that was more manageable for them. And so I'm going to kind of end here with this idea that disability justice is very much a different approach to access than disability rights. And it questions what it is we have access to. Instead of thinking about accessibility as something that brings in more people, that brings in more revenue, it helps us think about the worldly configuration that we participate in and how it is that we can embrace the disruption of disability. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to pass it back to Rachel.
This is Rachel speaking. Thank you so much, Sean. That was great, and I think it really allows us to see the why of what we're doing. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass over to Charlotte in 1 second. Charlotte Jacob McGuire is advisor, disability and access at the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montreal. Sorry, I said that so badly. And is a consultant in inclusive practices. Her focus is the intersection of disability studies and visual arts. She holds an MSc in anthropology from the University of Oxford. Please remember that Charlotte is presenting in French, and if you need to access the simultaneous interpretation, please go to the globe-looking button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click whichever language works best for you. And now over to Charlotte. That is the end of my thought.
Okay, so can you see my screen or no? Wait. Are we good?
Yes.
Perfect. Alors, bonjour.
So, hello. My name is Charlotte Jacob McGuire, and I'm a white woman with long black hair, and I have a pale blue shirt, and I use the pronoun her. So a little bit about me. I'm an advisor on ability, diversity, and accessibility at the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal. I have a master in anthropology museum, and I've been working for an organization that supports inclusion of disabled persons, and I'm myself a disabled person. In my personal life, I am an activist for the defense of a right of disabled persons, and I'm part of the expertise committee for Chantier d'Accessibilité of the City of Montreal. And I'm also a consultant for the Conseil des Arts de Montréal in inclusive practices. So if you have any questions after my presentation, please do not hesitate to write to me at the following address, charlotte.jacob.mcguire at macm.org. And we'll also have coffee side chat on April the 22nd to follow up on that. So let's go back first to my position. Well, In 2019, the museum has received financial support as part of the action plan, government action plan, Plan d'action gouvernemental en culture. So it came with a grant, and there was also a willingness from the MAC, the museum service, to adopt the tools in order to develop a project. In that case, one of the tools was a position dedicated to publications and to and so MAC created that temporary position in 2019. I was hired as a coordinator for serving education and developing the material regarding special needs. And as time went by, I became the coordinator to universal accessibility. And then I became advisor for accessibility at the museum, at the MAC. Now, regarding sustainable changes in the whole museum. So my mandate in 2019 was to make the MAC, the MAC, known to specialized organizations, to make the museum also attractive to people with disabilities, but also my role was to review and design accessibility tools to ensure universal accessibility is met. So build networks, create links, and offer solutions to people. What existed already, what was already in place, there was a plan with respect to people with disabilities that is requested by the Office des Personnes Handicapées du Québec. So all the parapublic institutions and the ministries, the departments of the government of Quebec have to develop an action plan on a yearly basis. There was the funding. There was also the willingness of the educational department to accommodate people with disabilities also. Now today, my mandate is to develop and implement a strategy in order to improve accessibility and fight against ableism in the museum. So we're proposing initiatives that allow to preserve relations with different persons. So persons in a situation of a disability and deaf persons. And I'm also developing resources internally and develop programs dedicated to those communities. So what are those sustainable and intersectional changes at the MAC, at the museum? So what are the actions, the tools, the activities that were developed at the MAC so far? Well, with the person in charge of the General Secretary, I co-drafted a policy on universal accessibility and anti-ableism. It was adopted on in June 2021 by the Board of Directors. Now that policy was aiming at making sure that all the employees in the museum were accountable to the museum itself. So we also developed partnerships with different organizations. And those organizations will listen to, and MAC would also receive the criticism. So that's exactly what Nadia Duguay, co-founder of the EXECO organization, said, taking criticism as a gift. So around that, we developed a full training program to see how we can accompany organizations like Kiro, Studio, École à pas de géant for autistic children, and the Institute Intérêt. Because AGEN is a very important drive when we're talking about exclusion. And the purpose was to make everybody more comfortable with the disabilities at large. So the MAC, the museum, has also begun subtitling videos on the web. And with the pandemics, MAC has also turned towards research. Now, in particular, the research carried out by the team of Véro Leduc about artistic practices of disabled persons in Canada. And there was also the setting up of an internal committee. So accessibility, diversity, and representativity. And because disability is part of the diversity, and if the deaf artists represent 15% of the community of artists, they only receive 7% of the funding dedicated to disabled artists. So according to the policy adopted in 2021, the MAC began a reflection on the potential development of a residency program aiming at strengthening the visibility and acknowledgement of professional artists who are deaf or in a situation of who are disabled. Then another tool that was developed, I reviewed the hiring process with human resources by writing an access rider. So what is an access rider? Basically, in a professional context, an access rider, what we call access rider, is useful for the persons who are involved, whether it's the employer, the colleagues, the worker, himself or herself in that situation. So when we make the needs known, the institution and the whole setting can adjust. So this is rather for the employees of MAC, but also for the artists who are presenting exhibitions at the MAC. Now, we at the MAC, we do not have any volunteers working. We only have employees. We also developed what we call an evolving lexicon to be up to date with the language uses. And we also developed a sustainable development plan. We also began a review of our architectural plans in order to transform the MAC by 2025. We also are also reviewing the suppliers. We have developed partnerships as well with EXECO, or the Canadian Institute for Visually Impaired Persons. And we are also reviewing all the accessibility section of the website. And we had to review the website because it was not fully accessible before. And we are also publishing a reading list about art and ability diversity. Now, my recommendations, first of all, it takes a lot of time, lot of time. It's not something that can happen over a couple of months. It takes even a few years. There are things that I say to some members of the staff that went a long way, but it took sometimes a year or a couple of years. So a piece of advice, find your allies. A professor of UQAM, Leduc, who's actually the first professor, hearing impaired professor in Quebec, she was telling me that the MAC, like UQAM, is a very large boat. So it's very difficult to handle alone, and it's true. So you need to find your allies. Then a third recommendation, to make sure that you have some moral clarity and a long-term vision. Those are very important qualities to develop, to have, because some barriers are still present. So obstacles to professionalization of artists, of disabled artists, are still present. There are issues also regarding the cultural sharing, and also issues linked to ableism. Among my other recommendations, carrying out projects with other organizations. So other organizations mean also not necessarily museums. So in my case, it was about writing articles and publishing articles in different papers like Vie des Arts to be more visible in Quebec. So on a broader scale. Secondly, the Conseil des Arts of Montreal launched last year a specific support for artists and cultural workers who are deaf or have a disability. And I've received one of those, I've obtained one of those supports in order to carry out research on the collection of MAC done by specifically by artists or cultural workers who are deaf or have a disability. So we work in collaboration on a weekly basis. And now there's clearly an interest about that on a broader scale. In terms of good practices, I have listed some of those for you. So for example, draft universal accessibility and anti-ableism policy. Another good practice is to hire cultural workers who are disabled. Then hire on the board of directors cultural workers who are interested in critical disability studies and disability, and who are also interested in mad and deaf artistic practices. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was great. Really appreciate you being. Do you already have some questions? Would you prefer that we hold it to the end, to the panel, or how would you?
Yeah, hold it to the panel, I think. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And again, everyone, sorry, this is Rachel speaking. We're now going to take a 5-minute break. So it is 2:28 by my clock. So we'll be back at 2:38 to hear from Ophira. Thank you, everyone. See you soon. Hello, and welcome back from the break. This is Rachel speaking. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our final presenter of the afternoon, Ophira Kaloff. Ophira is a multi-award-winning disabled writer, performer, and producer. Her work weaves together music, comedy, and storytelling, seeking to crypt the script in both process and content. Please remember, feel free to put your questions in the chat box as we go. Thanks. Over to Ophira, and that is the end of my thought.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and also thank you for having me here. I feel very lucky having gotten to go third and get the chance to listen to everything that Sean and Charlotte so brilliantly said. To introduce myself, my name is Ophira. I use both she and they pronouns. And as a visual description, I'm a white disabled person with short, dark hair, kind of spiky today. I'm wearing dark plastic glasses, a white and navy blue neck brace, and I'm currently seated in what I call my spoonie chair. Spoonie being a word that a lot of folks within the disability and chronic illness communities use as an identifier. It's very comfortable. My legs are elevated. I'm really living the life over here. I also tend to use quite a lot of hand gestures, and so that will likely happen over the course of this meeting. It's always a question as to whether I'm going to knock over my phone or computer. Fingers crossed that won't happen today. give a little bit of a sense of who I am and how I'm coming into this conversation. I'm someone who wears many hats. As Rachel mentioned, I work as an artist within sort of different facets of entertainment. I have kind of dabbled through from opera and classical music to comedy, theater, public art, film and TV. And I also work as a facilitator of spaces, more on the administrative side, thinking through process and specifically focusing on how we can build processes, whether it's a performance experience, a rehearsal, a timeline, an on-set production, or a learning program of some kind that works for people. You know, spaces that actually feel good and comfortable and allow deaf, mad, and disabled folks like myself to thrive. So I'm going to share my screen here, which is always the moment of truth. Here we go. Let's see how that's doing. Is that showing up?
Yes.
Brilliant. Oh, but it is moving faster than I wanted it to. Okay, so I wanted to focus the conversation today on this question, what do you need? I will be very upfront. I have a complicated relationship with this question. On the one hand, I love it. I love being given the opportunity to, you know, that acknowledgement that I have some access needs, the opportunity to disclose them when I'm creating a space. I want to know what other people need. But I often find that within whether it's an institution or anything with an existing framework, there's kind of an invisible addition to that question. And it really goes back to something that Sean said earlier. The question to me often feels like, what do you need to fit in to our space? What do you need to fit into our process, our framework? And sometimes that's a framework that really hasn't considered me at all. Sometimes it's a framework that maybe has, but I still, you know, maybe don't fit quite perfectly. And so the onus kind of falls on me to be able to fit into that specific space. And sometimes the answer is pretty simple for me. I'm a wheelchair user, and so, you know, there's some very straightforward things with that. I need stair-free access to a space, and that includes the washroom, that includes, you know, any sort of parts of the environment that I'm going to be in. But if we get a little bit more specific, I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user. And if I'm there using my walker, my needs actually look a bit different. I, on my wheelchair, can go as far as I want to go. It's just me pushing a joystick. If I have to go around to different hallways to find my stair-free pathway, no problem. If I'm on my walker and have to go around numerous hallways to get to an elevator, all of a sudden that accommodation really doesn't work for me anymore. And so this question, while it's so simple on the outside, I think that there's a lot of layers. And as I chat today, my focus is bringing up some more specific experiences that I've had so that we can answer that question of sort of what comes next. When you've kind of set your intentions for a space, you have your, you know, you figured out what kind of access measures you're building into your process. What comes next for the individuals who are navigating that space, whether they're an artist, whether they're a staff member, or whether they're an audience member? And also, again, just reiterating, any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll keep an eye out if there's any that can be incorporated now, or if they're more for the Q&A after, then we'll do that as well. So this next slide, and I want to note, I went a little bit whimsical with the slides. So the image, there's a title with sort of it looks like a Post-it note attached with pieces of tape at the side. And it says accessibility can be, and then there's a breakdown of, it can be personal, situational, and relational. So starting with the personal, I think there's often this assumption that, and again, as both Sean and Charlotte brought up, that access can be this one size fits all, or that it's something we can assume looking at someone. But access needs can be so individual and very specific in ways that I wrote here that we might not imagine, but I would probably go further to say we cannot imagine. We don't know what a specific person needs. For me, I think often when I show up at a theater space there as an audience member, the immediate thought is that I need the accessible seating. I show up in my wheelchair. If there's a space where wheelchairs go, great, we did it. Except I also have a disability that relates to my spine. I wear a neck brace. Often that wheelchair seating is in the front row. And if the stage is elevated, I can't really lift my head up to see what's going on stage. And so it ends up being a really painful experience for me that is specific to my needs and to anyone who has similar needs to me. There might be someone else who requires wheelchair accessible seating that front row is perfect for. Right? There's also considerations about, I might need to get out really quickly. Is the area that the wheelchair seating is located, is that an easy thing for me to do? Is that, not just embraced by the show and allowed by the show, but also logistically easy to navigate? Another thing that comes up is that accessibility really is situational. Sometimes when I get that question of what do you need, I truly have no idea, because my answer really depends on the environment and the activity. It also can vary. My needs can change day to day. So one day maybe I feel great in a space that's brightly lit. The next day I really just need to be in the dark and really need things to be calm on the sensory front. I remember my first ever improv class, I showed up and I was asked that question, what do you need? And I was like, I think I'm pretty okay as long as I don't have to, sit on the floor or, transfer out of my chair, I should be fine. And the first game that was set up was a game called Clap Focus, where a bunch of us stood in a circle, or in my situation sat, and you pass along a clap to someone else in the circle, making eye contact and making sure that they noticed. And for the first time, I realized that I can't turn my head to the right or the left. And I would have had that situation hadn't come up in my life before that moment. It wasn't something that I could have known to put out there at the beginning of my experience. It was something that came up in the moment. And then my favorite thing when thinking about access is the idea that our needs are relational to each other. Our ways of existing, of communicating, moving, and more directly influence and impact each other. And I think this is a huge learning from disability justice, and really thinking of collective access, of interdependence, and the ways in which we affect each other. None of us exist in a vacuum or in isolation. And that's something that I'm going to touch on in a little bit more detail as as we move through. But as a very simple example, you know, sometimes people's needs affect each other or are different. 3 years ago, before the pandemic, back in the before times, I had recently had a surgery and was feeling very sensitive. And I went to a relaxed performance because my thought was, this is going to be great. You know, relaxed performances are designed to be a bit gentler on the sensory front. I'll be able to leave if I need to. This is my way to enjoy this show. And I didn't realize that as other people were engaging with a relaxed performance, as they were making noise and moving and engaging in exactly the way that they needed to and exactly the way they were supposed to, my sensory symptoms were triggered. I wasn't able to be in a space where other people were moving around. And that's something that kind of has to do with the people and figuring out who you're sharing space with, how you're sharing space together, and finding ways to then move forward together. Because there's always a way. Just last week, I facilitated a workshop where we had ASL interpretation, and one participant let me know afterwards that they experienced visual vertigo. And having interpretation right beside the speaker was really disorienting for that participant, and really created a negative experience for them. And on the surface, that's a moment of thinking like, oh no, you know, what can we do? One person's need is in direct opposition to another person's need, and we're trying to find a way to exist together. But as we sort of chatted to each participant and figured out the specifics, we found a solution that, you know, involved some technology and highlighting, spotlighting versus pinning, the creative placements of towels on one person's screen. We could dive into each person's specific ways of being to find that solution that we really could not, again, have thought of when we were first envisioning what we assumed might come up as access needs. It really needed to be specific and personal. And, you know, to Charlotte's point, we needed time for that. We needed time within our framework to experiment and figure this out together. So with this in mind, I wanted to dive into a couple of experiences that I've had, some learnings, to see if there's anything in there that might be helpful as we think about these things. So the first one is a show that I was lucky enough to co-create called Generally Hospital. And on this slide, there's an image of a person pulling on a medical glove. The image focuses on their two hands. One of them is inside a glove. One of them is just finishing that pull. And the title, Generally Hospital. And this was my first time producing a show. It was a show at the Toronto Fringe Festival. And I was so excited to finally have the opportunity to shape an experience in a way that, in my mind, really prioritized access. I wanted an experience that I could engage in, an experience that I could invite my friends to and the broader community. And I thought in advance of all of those kind of checklist items that, you know, maybe checklist is the wrong word, very important things. But I thought about sort of the things that I knew about, which were relaxed performances, having audio description, and we integrated ASL interpretation through a shadowing method and deaf community consultation as well. And, you know, there were a few things beyond that, you know, thinking through, we had thought through the process for service animals and priority seating and things of that nature. We had our access plan. And then for me, as a performer, I thought, okay, I use a wheelchair, so I need a stair-free performance space. Great, I'm good, we're done. And when the show actually came around, some things were great, and some things I just really had not thought of. For my needs, I did not consider the way that the audience would affect me. There was one show where an audience member showed up with a service animal, something that, we had very explicitly made clear that we had a plan for and were welcoming of. We had seating in the front row of the theater, which was essentially, because it was a black box theater, the same level that the performance was taking place on. And during the show, I kind of whizzed around in my wheelchair a fair bit and got pretty close to the audience. And usually it was fine. I did not realize until that animal was present that my vision, my peripheral vision, looking towards the ground, isn't very good. And that service animal was a dog who was a black lab who, with my vision, essentially blended into the floor. And so we had this moment of panic right before performing of realizing that I was at risk of accidentally driving over this dog's paws. I had no idea what we were going to do, and we had to delay the performance and create some guidelines for me to know as a performer what I needed. Again, something relational, situational, personal, things that couldn't have come up without having that in the moment experience. I also didn't realize in that show that when the lights went out on stage, I couldn't see. I learned that by opening night. I drove into a set piece and had the moment where an audience member had to come rescue me. All sorts of things that we learned going through. And so I really appreciated having that learning experience and having the chance. But in my mind, I went, okay, I just didn't plan well enough. So the next time I had an opportunity to produce a show, the show was called Literally Titanium. And on this slide, there's a screenshot of the front page of our access guide. It says, Ophira Kalof, Literally Titanium, Access Measures, January 8th to 19th, Factory Theater, 125 Bathurst Street. And there's an image of me in my wheelchair, tilted backwards with my arms sort of hanging down. And I found out that I was going to have the opportunity to put on this show, which is a solo show, while I was in the hospital recovering from brain surgery. I got the email while I was quite literally in the bed, and I had the thought of, oh no, this was an hour-long solo show, and I had no clue how I was going to do it. And so for this show, I started from the mindset of what do I need in order to do this? As a producer, as an artist, as a person in the space, what do I need? And some of those things were, I needed rest. I couldn't do a full hour of performing. I needed the chance to drink water throughout. I needed that extra time in the theater before performing so that if anything comes up, there's space and time to be able to figure out the ideal setup for both audience and myself. I learned that I could not drive my chair when there are no lights on stage. That was a takeaway from Generally Hospital. For being a producer, I learned that I needed more producers on my team, that I couldn't do it alone. And so we ended up having 3 producers where we each sort of supported each other and filled in as needed on each other's portfolios. As we built up the team, we realized that food was very important for all of our rehearsals, that we needed frequent breaks. We realized that all of our needs kind of varied. We were a team full of deaf and disabled individuals, and each day before, we'd have a plan for a rehearsal, but we'd also check in and say, hey, the plan was to sing opera today. Does anyone have a migraine? Because if so, we won't sign off for today. And then through that, we thought through the audience experience, thinking through having additional front of house support beyond what the festival allotted us. We even had a snow melting station because it was winter for anyone who was coming in with wheelchairs or a walker to sort of have the chance to brush the snow off, and that was important for me. We created a show that had multiple different sensory experiences, taking into account my needs and potential needs of the audience, along with audio description and ASL interpretation. And so with that show and that learning experience, I kind of wrote down here, and it's funny, this is a list, but I wanted to make it more of a circle or one of those boards with pins drawing connections, because I don't think there's a clear order for access. But I think when we ask the question, what do you need? When we're trying to invite someone into a space, we have to take away that second part of the question and really think, what do you need for us to be in community together? What do you need in order for us to have this artistic experience? And part of that is knowing the person asking has to know their capacity, has to know their own needs. That goes for the team as a whole, for all of the staff members involved. And as you sort of build a framework and a plan, there has to be that flexibility for individual experiences. That plan then really needs to be communicated as much as possible so that people can make their decisions and can flag areas that they might want to communicate about and then talk to you about, creating clear mechanisms for feedback and engagement throughout the process. And then the two most important words on this slide, I think, are adjust and repeat. Access isn't a destination, I don't think. If it is, I think that it's sort of like the shooting for the moon metaphor. It's something that we will constantly be working towards. It's creative, it's situational, it's exciting. Another quote from Mia Mingus, who Sean mentioned before, is access is love. And love isn't the kind of thing that you did it. Okay, we know we love each other, we're done. It's ongoing, it's an act of care, and full of possibilities. So I am so excited to have had this chance to chat together. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now as I'm at the end of my presentation. But again, any questions, I think we're moving into the panel section shortly.
This is Rachel speaking. Thank you so much, Afira. That was great. I'm welcoming back as well Sean and Charlotte, and we'll all be on screen together and we will start the panel. So I've had a few questions come up via text and message. So I'm just gonna dive right in if that's okay with everyone. So my first question is for Charlotte. Can you share a bit more on the structures or questions you ask in the Access Writer and how you communicate across your team to ensure that you're meeting the access points identified in the writer?
Yes, so there it is. So in the chat, I've linked the Access Writer, le guide d'accessibilité. And basically, you'll see that it's fairly plain. Actually, there are two different parts to it. So there's one, it's a ready-made access writer, so you just have to fill it out. And then there's a second one, which is actually tell us more about yourself. So there's one that's already made and one which is like, okay, tell us about yourself. And so at the museum, what we do is that this access writer is sent off to anyone who becomes an employee or an artist who will exhibit. So that pretty much kind of is becoming standard, because I have to say, like, you know, you want something to get applied, you do trainings with people, and then someone drops the ball, and you're like, okay, starting over. But I have to say that when it sort of, I don't know, it becomes like a reflex. So the more you do it, the more people will ask you, or it sort of becomes kind of a habit. But you don't develop a habit in 2 months. And it's frustrating. Like, I have to say, it is very frustrating to sit there and be calm with people. I have to say that. Like, it's not it's not agreeable to be the only disabled person in the room. It's horrible at times, but at the same time, I kind of have to kind of look at it within kind of it's like a much larger picture, and I have to say, okay, well, this is my vision for the next 5 years. This is how we're going to get there, and we won't get there within a year, but within 1, 2, 3 years, maybe. So kind of that's what I have to tell myself. So that's, did I answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much. And just to again point out that the link is in the chat to the Access rider, so folks can take a look at it. Okay, Charlotte or Sean, any suggestions from the, oh, wait, sorry. I have to ask the first question first, which is for Ophira, and then we move into that. Sorry about that. Ophira, as an artist, is it helpful for an organization to identify a point person or more to work with you on accessibility? And ideally, we do understand that accessibility should be shared across the entire organization, but how do we ensure accountability, clarity, and that you know who to contact?
This is a really good question. My answer to it is yes, with that understanding that this is a shared responsibility. It can't be one person. But I find what often happens is that the onus falls on the artist, on the disabled artist, to advocate for themselves. And I think if there is a specific role of an advocate within the organization who takes on, you know, that task of raising things as they come up that may not be catched by the team, understanding that the solutions for this have to be found within the organization as a whole and within the team. I think that's a really valuable thing, and that would let me as an artist be able to focus on the thing I'm there for, as opposed to trying to navigate my way through the space.
Excellent, thank you. So now the follow-up for Sean and Charlotte, each of your opinions, please. Any suggestion from an organization standpoint on having that advocate within an organization?
This is Sean. So I think in terms of having an advocate in an organization, like I'm very lucky to be working at Tangled, where all of us are disability identified, and so there isn't quite as much of a need for a singular advocate to sort of push for access to be recognized. But I think it's really important to be able to have an advocate from within an organization, because that's oftentimes how I personally like to approach change in structural organizations, to have a few allies who are there almost not really sneaking about, but they're able to kind of navigate an organization's culture. They're able to advocate for some of these things in a way that doesn't feel like it's an outsider who doesn't understand your organization doesn't understand, you know, the like the finances. Like oftentimes those are the like some of the biggest challenges are things like the finances and the personnel like capacity. And so I think it's important that you have advocates from within an organization who can help you navigate what's possible, and to be able to make access a commitment rather than something that becomes this sort of one time, you know, feel good sort of event that happens, and then the rest of your program's not accessible. Like I think an ally and an advocate from within can really help to continuously think about, you know, change from a structural point rather than trying to make it something that's superficial, than something that's not a commitment, basically.
This is Charlotte. I would say that in a non-disability organization, the advocate role is definitely super important. However, I just don't, I want to say that I'm not that person. So for example, like, because oftentimes what happens is um, the people who host you will be like, oh, well, we have a question, or, and then this piles on. And so what I've found wonderful in my bosses is that they've sort of taken that onus on them as well. And so, yes, like I'm definitely all pro advocate positions, but I'm also very, I'm very conscious of the fact that every employee in the museum has to have that knowledge that, and it doesn't mean necessarily have a very incisive knowledge about disability. It's just having this understanding and just this, I don't know, global understanding that it comes with privilege, and it comes, you know, just that basic understanding that disability is, let's look at it from an intersectional point of view. And so the kind of the, oh, like this is like the feel good like action that I've led is going to become, no, it's not right. We have to auto describe every movie. We have to, you know, so slow, well, not slowly, but kind of with time, yeah, I, yeah, so I'm a bit rambling, but that's my thought. So yes, advocate, but don't put it on the disabled person at this one institution.
Yes, I love that. This is Rachel speaking. Yeah, you know, we're all becoming more aware of not piling that work on the people that we're hoping to ally or to be an ally to. So I love that you brought that up. I have to say that when I do presentations on relaxed performances, I always talk about the why. Like, why are we doing this? You know, and I've recently had a couple of people say to me that all performances should now be relaxed performances with access points, and our typical traditional performance should be the one-off. And I was like, yes, that sounds amazing. Okay, I wanted to just address Afira for a quick second. I really appreciate your honesty about what do you need. It's taken me a long time to be able to answer that for myself, and I couldn't figure out why until you explained that. So thank you. But to the panel at large, so that sort of started making me think about, what about the weight that's in that to fit in? Like, what do you need to fit in? And I was just wondering, you know, the layers and the weight of that phrase,
how do you feel that's impacting deaf and disability arts and access? I don't know. I don't know if I phrased that well, but let me know your thoughts.
This is Sean. I will take a stab at that. Because it made me think about what Yinka Shonibare in the UK, who's a disability artist, says about disability arts. Yinka, who is, an incredible Turner Prize nominated artist, talks about disability arts as the last avant-garde, and he kind of parallels the emergence of disability arts to movements like feminist arts, black arts, queer arts, like all those movements that have helped change the kind of mainstream conversation. And I think that's what, for me, this notion of fitting in, that's what helps push against this notion of fitting in, while simultaneously helping us to sort of do that at the same time. Because the reality is that artists right now still do have to, quote unquote, fit in to a certain degree. And how you fit in is sort of designated by almost that idea of the artistry. And that, for me, that's why I often go back to this quote, is that the way we're doing things is not necessarily like a lesser version, or it's not a version that can't compete. It's that we don't want to compete. The conversations in the past were always about how can disabled artists also be a part of this art system. And when you reframe it as we're not part of that system, we are moving forward with our own practices and our own traditions and our own cultures, and we are instead inviting others to participate in it, then suddenly you're reframing not that disabled folks have to fit in, that they have to, conform to a certain way, but instead, like, you can think of our practices and our cultural traditions as a different way of being. And I think there is a degree of privilege to being able to even do that, to being able to have the way of, framing your art and being able to write a grant that helps you articulate that. But I think we're slowly moving in that direction so that we can embrace difference. And, I think a lot about just with the example that I gave around Gloria Swain and how we framed the idea of artists who can't necessarily participate. And ever since then, Tangled has started including care clauses into our contracts, trying to consider how it is that we can create better care for artists. And I think it was something that was always there for us, for Tangled as a space, but how can we put it into these kind of colonial written contractual statements? And so we've begun fleshing out the idea of like a care clause of some sort, and it's constantly changing with each show. But that's one of the ways, right, that we can try to move away from the idea that we have to fit in, that we have to like always abide by the contract. Instead, maybe there's a clause that helps us think about difference as valuable. So yeah, that is one of my thoughts around it.
This is Rachel. Thanks, Sean. That's great. I love the idea of the care clause. Like, how can we sort of care for you and for each other? I really like that, and I appreciate it. I wanted to say that one thing that I seem to have gotten from everyone's presentation today is that we need to work on relaxing our processes as well, that we really need to look at the structure in which we create art and present art, and really check in and see whether that's still working. You know, do these structures still work for people? And if not, why not? And what can we do to make those changes?
Okay.
So we are coming to the close today. I'm sorry that we only had a short amount of time for our presentation, but this is just a taste of what you'll get on Friday at the coffee chat. So again, I just really wanted to say thank you to our presenters today, Sean, Charlotte, and Ophira. The presentations were amazing. I would like to remind people to sign up for Friday. We're from 10:30 until 11:30, and it's very informal. If you think our presentations are relaxed, you should check out our Fridays. I'm just going to turn things over to Lauren in a minute, but once again, thank you to Sean and Charlotte and Ophira for taking the time today and sharing your stories and your knowledge and your experience. And to those of you that took the time to come out today or that are watching this recording, thank you for coming on this journey with us. Have a great day, and that is truly the end of my thought.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you to our presenters. This was amazing. I'm just going to very quickly share my screen. So I'll just do some adjustments on the screen here. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone. You'll notice that in the chat, my colleague Trisha has been posting links to the coffee chat. We encourage you to sign up and let us know if you have any access points that we can accommodate. First of all, thank you as well to the Government of Ontario for their generous funding of this Enabling Change project. Thank you to our art service organization partners, Ontario Presents and Réseau Ontario, and to Maeva for her welcome today. Thank you to all my colleagues behind the scenes, Boran, Trisha, Fanny, and Rachel in the prep, all of our interpreters, Asl, Lsq, French and English, and Captioning as well. Everyone attending today, it's so wonderful to see names come up that we recognize and new names. So on the screen is a slide that, again, reminds you of the coffee chat this Friday. There's also a QR code to complete a feedback survey. We do value your feedback, and it's important to us to know that we're doing the right things as we go in the series. And you'll also get some materials soon in your inbox about a Tell a Friend campaign. So to be able to share the information about these sessions for this one and for upcoming ones, our next session will be on May 3rd. And as I've pasted in the chat, it's about community collaborations. I think it's going to be a really wonderful way to end the series. And we'll have Erin Ball and Theatre Pass Mirai to talk about their experience there. Thank you all so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And end of thought for me and end of session. Thank you so much. Take good care.